a market lead and a technical lead and maybe a design lead, you've got enough people that are making the kinds of decisions and providing the kinds of leadership that tend to be there. So this person evolves into that area. So, all I can say is there's many ways to provide leadership, and the textbook stuff you get on Agile might not just be the perfect way. I think maybe there might be other ways. And there are problems with those ones. So, here's a few others. They may have their problems too. It's something to think about. But this is, by the way, the classic lean matrix approach that you'll find in almost all lean environments, in lean companies, in Toyota, in 3M, where I worked. Very much this classic matrix approach is a very, very common management approach and can work very well as long as this is the teacher and this is the one that is the product leader, and you have balance between the two. Last one. Failure to improve constantly improve. Whatever you do doesn't matter how you start. It matters that you don't stay there. Whatever you're doing, if you're doing the same thing you did a year ago, it's wrong. It needs to constantly get better. I think maybe that's the most important thing, so it doesn't matter what process you have to constantly make it better. And this fundamental lean principle, constantly improve, tends to get sort of lost in Agile. I mean, we have this thing called retrospective. I always thought retrospective was a really watered down approach to process improvement. I still do. If you look at classic process improvement processes, oops, I don't know how I got there. If you look at classic process improvement processes, they're very much more structured and aggressive than a retrospective. I've sometimes seen retrospectives work. Usually I haven't. But a classic process improvement process works more or less like this. And this is a kata. Mike Rocker, who wrote the Toyota kata, says that at Toyota, they have all these things that people copy. They copy Kanban, they copy, all kinds of things like that. Well, they can copy value stream maps. But that's not what they should be copying. They should be copying how come Toyota is using Kanban, and how come Toyota is using value stream maps. Why? Is because they invented them using the improvement kata. The improvement kata says that everybody in the company, well, you know what a kata is, right? Anybody in martial arts, it's a constantly repeated pattern. And what you try to do with the improvement kata is make sure that everybody in the company learns this when they come in, from a mentor, from a teacher, that their constant, most important thing to do is the improvement kata. And that means you start by imagining what perfection would be. What would it be if we were perfect? Now, you're not perfect, right? Nobody's perfect. So you then say, okay, where are we now? And you take a good, hard, honest look at today's situation. Not kidding yourself and pretending it's better than it is, but what is it really? And it's firsthand. You go there, you understand it in detail. And because there's such a distance, the next thing you do is you say, okay, what can I reasonably expect to do in the near future? What's my next target on the way to perfection? And then you do let me show you this. You're not here because there's something in the way. Then you use a classic process improvement process. Plan, do, check, act is the way Deming spoke of it. Something in which you look at your problems and you use some sort of a problem-solving loop to remove this obstacle. And then you get there, and then you do it again. So you're constantly heading towards a vision of perfection. And a vision of perfection is not some process that you read about. It's where you need to be. Your company, your software, your code base needs to be. It's not where somebody says you need to be, but where you understand perfection is. So you use a really classic process improvement process to get from here to here. Then you do another step, and then you do another step. And this constant improvement is part of the job of everybody. There is time set aside for it. It's stuff that people are expecting to do as part of their day-to-day job. So I'm just going to close with this because these slides will be available for you. This is a really good place to learn more about good process improvement processes, managing to learn. It's from the Lean Constructionist, or the lean.org. And here's a model of the way that you look at issues. If you want to solve a problem, well, why is it important? What's the root cause? And what are kinds of, make sure that you really identify the root cause. You run experiments, and then you make adjustments. So that's kind of what I have, and now we have time, if you want, for some questions. Or you get to go home and take your pick. I mean, I can't promise you can ask in Spanish like yesterday because of no translators.
I heard and read that Scrum takes a certain number of management steps, as you have the Scrum Masters or whatever, and then or team leaders, and then section leaders, and blah, blah, blah. And they tend to say that you have a maximum degree of these management steps, so that's Lean has something like that?
Yeah, this particular thing that I showed you here is the classic matrix management structure that just about every Lean organization I know uses. Okay?
The teacher and the...
Just a minute. Let me go back to it. See if I can find it here. Here it is, right here. Okay, so just about every Lean organization that I know has a matrix structure where the making stuff, especially in development, if you look at the way Toyota does product development, for example, there is a chief engineer who is both market and technical responsible. And there is what they call section heads, which are the competency leaders, who are also the people managers. And these people support the chief engineer by providing people with competence. They have made sure, say you're going to provide people who are going to do the structural engineering. Okay, so the competency leader has created very good experience, with lots of practice and developing a lot of expertise, structural engineers. There's some junior ones and some more senior ones, and the more junior ones will get a lot of supervision, and the more senior ones will get less supervision, and those good structural engineers will be part of the product leaders team, the chief engineers team. And the structure, the section head supports to make sure that the chief engineer gets the kind of people that are necessary to make sure that product is successful. And I've seen that in a lot of other companies. Every company that I would call quote-unquote lean that I know of, and I've looked at their management structure, ends up with something like this. There's a theory that in the end, at any scale, you have to have both kinds of leadership. You have to have something that focuses on the customer and the end result and the technology. And you have to have a way to have competency spread, focused in the organization, even though it has to be spread across teams. So you need a way to bring the competency, people with a given competency together and make sure they have good leadership and good teachers. And you need a way to make sure that the product has good leadership and moves forward to be the right product. And somehow you have to manage the balance between the two. And that balance is the primary thing that I have always seen focused on in almost every management structure that I've run into. Now, software tends to be a little different. It tends to have ignored some of these roles here. We don't need them. Well, I think that's wrong. And they added some others that they thought were necessary, which maybe temporarily are interesting. But really, from my perspective, thinking hard about how these roles are done is the first step. And then maybe after you've got those roles thought about and figured out how they're handled, then you can think about other roles too.
Your question hinted at hierarchy. Yeah. And hierarchy is bad. in the sense that the further you are from a problem that your company is addressing, your team is addressing, the less you know and the less good your decisions are going to be. Instead of building layer after layer of hierarchy in one organization, it's far better to fragment the organization. Keep the functional, the group that's developing a product to say 150 people. Then you don't need much hierarchy. And have multiple 150 person groups making up your company rather than a multiple 1,000-person group making up the company.
Let me give you an example, okay? My favorite example of that is Pixar. So you know Pixar, they do movies. They're extraordinarily successful. And maybe you've seen some of them, like Toy Story. Okay, so anyway, Pixar is organized into groups. They are actually more like 200 or so people that are going to put a movie together, and that's a team. And it's led by a director and a producer. So the director has complete artistic and design authority, and the producer is the guy that has to worry about the deadlines and the budget. They work together as co-equal team leaders, and then the team is, generally speaking, sort of half creative folks and half techies, because we're talking about animation, so there's a lot of software involved. And Pixar has worked very hard to make sure that the creative folks and the techie guys have the same salaries and learn each other's trades through their Pixar University. But that group, that movie group, is pretty much the director and the producer. They run that team for the 2 years it takes to make the movie. And the people stay with that, and that's that movie. There is a creative brain trust that gives guidance and does reviews of the work of the team, but pretty much that movie is that independent group of about 200 people. And they don't have much more hierarchy than the guiding coalition that reviews the work of each one of the movie teams. And they've done some pretty great stuff with that kind of structure. The company that I work for, 3M, tended to have divisions that always broke up if they got very big. And each separate division was a separate little business. And the fact that we had pretty much separate business units, you could move between. But this business unit kind of did its own thing. It had a vice president, and if you didn't count the people in the manufacturing plant, it might have a couple hundred people in the technical, the marketing, and the corporate area that were putting together that business. And those kinds of groups don't develop this great big sort of slowness that very large hierarchical companies tend to develop. Because we really could make decisions amongst, when you have 150 or so people, you kind of know them all. When you have 500, you don't anymore. And that group could really move because it had pretty much control of its own destiny as long as it met certain corporate financial guidelines. So, more questions? Yes?
Yeah, what are the artifacts? Backlog, review, planning, retrospective.
Oh,
Maybe
artifacts.
how many about Scrum, but
Well, when I said artifacts in this particular slide that I have here, which I need to make bigger so I can find faster. Here we go. When I said artifacts here, these artifacts are tests and test results, okay, in this artifact. And tests are specifications. So if you think about software, and you think about any regulatory environment, whether it's medical devices or aircraft software or anything like that, there will be regulations that say that you have to write a specification and then you have to prove that your software is mapped and does what that specification does. Now, just let's pretend we don't have this thing called tests, and instead we have this thing called specification, which is actually a test. Okay, it's something you can run. And in fact, people that do that, those kinds of stuff in regulatory environments, they generally do have executable specifications because it's so hard to do the mapping of the code to the spec. But if you have a spec that actually runs the code, your artifact here is the fact that the test ran on such and such a day, and here's what the answers were, here's what the results were. So here, what your artifact repository is the results of all of these things. Now, if you talk about the things you were talking about, you name things like backlog.
Yeah, yesterday you said, yeah.
I don't like backlogs.
Yes,
It is.
Okay? I mean, to me, every time I heard backlog, at least in the context of Scrum, it was, well, if you have customers that want you to do something and you don't have time, well, just put it on your backlog. That will shut them up. Okay? That's about the least transparent thing that I can imagine. And I think that that's a bad mistake. The last thing in the world you should be doing is building up this great big list and making your customers have this big puzzle as to when or whether what they want is going to get done.
Great way to insult your customers.
Yes, great way to insult customers. Instead, you want a short backlog that is got a known length, because you know your capacity. How many weren't here yesterday? See my arrow. Okay, I'm going to show you my arrow again then, because I think it's cool. So, for those of you that were here, you can just be bored, that's okay. But